Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of Philosopher's Symposium. Whether you're a passionate philosopher, or just someone casually interested about the relationship of philosophy to everyday life, this video should have something for you to enjoy. This video serves as the introduction to a new series that will explore a variety of philosophical topics in an informal but in-depth podcast-like format. If you're already familiar with this channel, you'll notice that Philosopher's Symposium takes on a different structure than what you're used to. This series, which will accompany the two series already featured on this channel, will take a deeper dive into philosophical topics while still aiming to make philosophy accessible to the average viewer. With that in mind, let's begin. What are the primary goals of education? At first glance, that might seem obvious. Isn't education first and foremost preparation for work? Don't we go to primary and secondary school to get a useful, generalized education, so that we can gain knowledge and skill sets versatile enough to prepare us to specialize in any field we want in early adulthood? Well, that's certainly how the American education system is designed, at least in theory. Education is viewed as a kind of human capital, or an economic resource society invests in for the benefit of its own productivity. However, while most agree that education should help prepare people for work, the scope of education is often much broader. Philosophers from Plato to Augustine to Rousseau comment on the value of education for instilling virtue, forming good citizens, and helping people approach the world rationally and with a healthy dose of skepticism towards popular narratives. Even today, most politicians, at least in the United States, agree that education should help form students into good Americans who know their history, for better or for worse, and develop a sense of social consciousness that helps them promote good in their communities, their nations, and the world at large. Most people, if polled, would probably agree that education should help shape students into better citizens. What becomes contentious, however, is what good citizenship actually looks like, and who precisely gets to determine that. What values should we instill in our nation's youth? What goals should we teach them to aspire to? These questions are far older than even the American Republic itself, being found in ancient writings from Greece to China. How did various societies determine which values to instill in their students? After all, no society has ever been perfectly homogeneous, so there will always be some degree of disagreement about such matters. In modern America, which has become so polarized it often seems like different sides of the political aisle are living in different realities, it would seem almost like agreement is impossible. In light of this, many people, especially on the political right, have started promoting what they call a values-neutral education that just teaches the basic skills of reading, writing, logic, mathematics, and scientific reasoning, with added basic knowledge of history, geography, the material sciences, etc. All questions about values, virtue, and citizenship are left either for the individual to determine for his or herself, or for the parents to instill. While, on the one hand, such an approach is understandable from the perspective of trying to preserve freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the primacy of the family, it nevertheless promotes a vision of education that is stripped of any kind of meaningful character formation. Is such a form of education possible? And, if so, is it even desirable? To answer this question, I'd like to begin with an anecdote. When I was studying in university, I took a course that examined the question of equality from an interdisciplinary perspective. One of my classes covered the topic specifically from the perspective of pro-capitalist economics. As a quick aside, for those concerned about bias, note that the following class was from the perspective of capitalist critical economics. Anyways, returning to the story, we had a visiting professor act as a guest lecturer, explaining to the class that while capitalism does indeed produce a variety of socially disruptive consequences, ranging from rapid mass urbanization to technology-driven creative destruction, to environmental degradation, to the growth of wealth and income inequality and social stratification. Ultimately, capitalism is a good thing, because the net wealth of everyone grows, society technologically develops, productivity increases, the globe becomes more interconnected, and on a large scale, everybody is better off for it. He mentioned the various criticisms of capitalism made from Marxist perspectives, and he ended by stating that, while capitalism has its problems, it's ultimately the best economic system because, at the end of the day, it works. Leaving aside the question of whether economics can actually be reduced to a dichotomy between capitalism and Marxism, I believe there are other possible systems. What I found interesting about his comment was the notion that capitalism is proven by its merits because, again, unlike Marxist systems as observed by 20th century history, quote, it works, end quote. That seems to beg the question, what does it mean for an economic system to work? That it achieves its stated goals? That it achieves goals that exist independent of the ideology behind that particular economic system? I was curious about this, so I raised my hand and asked the professor what specifically he meant by capitalism working. What specifically does it work for? What are the desired ends of capitalism? In response, he repeated some data about capitalism, despite its flaws, leading to people becoming wealthier overall, and he reiterated that capitalism just ultimately works. I found that answer noteworthy because, while I didn't ultimately question the data he was providing, I wondered to myself why collective enrichment was a standard for measuring the success of an economic system working, while social disruption and wealth inequality were somehow irrelevant. It appeared to me that economic metrics were taken as a given, such that economics, as commonly practiced, was solely about measurements and predictions, rather than asking more fundamental questions about what the ultimate goal of an economy is. Why do I bring that up? Well, much like with values-neutral education, which views education as a purely economic resource and nothing more, perhaps even something oppressive and threatening to individual liberty if it is made to be more, such a view of economics seems to strip human production and trade of its human elements, instead reducing it to values-neutral, strictly rational actions that can be assessed by purely empirical metrics that are predetermined and unquestioned. In both cases, while such reductionism might seem beneficial from the standpoint of simplifying complex human interactions, promoting productivity, and leaving the ideological biases of powerful institutions out of the picture, it ironically imposes, intentionally or not, a materialist vision of human nature that, over successive generations, begins to define the way the general populace views the world. It would seem that either the powers that be believe that they can manipulate the general population to do what is productive regardless of their worldview or desires, leading them to eventually become complacent to the agenda of the top-down, artificially constructed system. Opposition to this sentiment is expressed by Hayek in the second round of the Keynes v. Hayek rap battle by Emergent Order. People aren't chessmen you can move on a board at your whim, their dreams and desires ignored. Or, academia, and by extension the political establishment informed by its expertise, truly believes that the vast complexity of human desire, belief, and action can genuinely be reduced to purely logical valuations and assessments, meaning that human action is ultimately driven first and foremost by those impulses at a base level, such that everything else is merely a more complex extension of them. Here I'd like to introduce the work of a man who, while not strictly speaking a philosopher, nevertheless does the work of a philosopher, namely, questioning first principles. E.F. Schumacher was a man who definitely understood conventional economics. He was a statistician and economist who served as chief economic advisor to the British National Coal Board from 1950 to 1970. That said, his father was a professor of political economy, so he was driven to examine his work from angles that went beyond pure empirical analysis. During his time in what is now the nation of Myanmar, he was exposed to and challenged by Buddhist principles of thought that challenged the commonly held Western visions of what it meant to be economically rational. Over the years, as he re-examined his first principles, he also found himself inspired by the works of Mahatma Gandhi and the various papal encyclicals of the Catholic Church on social teaching and economics. Schumacher is perhaps most well known for his book, Small is Beautiful: Economics as if People Mattered. While he addresses a variety of topics in his book, I'd like to focus on two within this video. His thought experiment about Buddhist economics that challenges the reader to question the assumed first principles of economics, and his proposal for a well-ordered and truly valuable education, informed in significant part by his own vision of what it means to prepare somebody to be economically productive. His thought experiment about Buddhist economics doesn't aim to propose an economic system per se. Rather, its goal is to analyze how, if the goals of economics are assumed to be different in accord with a different worldview, that might change the way we assess the success of an economic system. Allow me to read an excerpt from his work. Quote, "Economists themselves, like most specialists, normally suffer from a kind of metaphysical blindness, assuming that theirs is a science of absolute and invariable truths without any presuppositions. Some go so far as to claim that economic laws are as free from metaphysics or values as the law of gravitation. We need not, however, get involved in arguments of methodology. Instead, let us take some fundamentals and see what they look like when viewed by a modern economist and a Buddhist economist. There is universal agreement that a fundamental source of wealth is human labor. Now, the modern economist has been brought up to consider labor or work as little more than a necessary evil. From the point of view of the employer, it is in any case simply an item of cost, to be reduced to a minimum if it cannot be eliminated altogether, say by automation. From the point of view of the workman, it is a disutility. To work is to make a sacrifice of one's leisure and comfort, and wages are a kind of compensation for the sacrifice. Hence, the ideal, from the point of view of the employer, is to have output without employees, and the ideal from the point of view of the employee is to have income without employment. The consequences of these attitudes, both in theory and in practice, are, of course, extremely far-reaching. If the ideal with regard to work is to get rid of it, every method that reduces the workload is a good thing. The most potent method, short of automation, is the so-called division of labor, and the classical example is the pin factory eulogized in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Here, it is not a matter of ordinary specialization, which mankind has practiced from time immemorial, but of dividing up every complete process of production into minute parts, so that the final product can be produced at great speed without anyone having had to contribute more than a totally insignificant, and in most cases, unskilled movement of his limbs. The Buddhist point of view takes the function of work to be at least threefold: to give man a chance to utilize and develop his faculties, to enable him to overcome his ego-centeredness by joining with other people in a common task, and to bring forth the goods and services needed for becoming existence. Again, the consequences that flow from this view are endless. To organize work in such a manner that it becomes meaningless, boring, stultifying, or nerve-wracking for the worker would be little short of criminal. It would indicate a greater concern with goods than with people, an evil lack of compassion, and a soul-destroying degree of attachment to the most primitive side of this worldly existence. Equally, to strive for leisure as an alternative to work would be considered a complete misunderstanding of one of the basic truths of human existence, namely that work and leisure are complementary parts of the same living process, and cannot be separated without destroying the joy of work and the bliss of leisure. From the Buddhist point of view, there are therefore two types of mechanization which must be clearly distinguished: one that enhances a man's skill and power, and one that turns the work of man over to a mechanical slave, leaving man in a position of having to serve the slave. Furthermore, if a man has no chance of obtaining work, he is in a desperate position, not simply because he lacks an income, but because he lacks this nourishing and enlivening factor of disciplined work which nothing can replace." End quote. There's a great deal more that he writes on these topics, but for now, I hope that this excerpt gives a sense of the kind of thought experiment he's trying to do. If we return to my anecdote about the guest lecturer talking about how capitalism is the best system because it works, we can now see why such a statement must necessarily be paired with an assessment of what the goals of an economy actually are. Otherwise, how can we tell if a system really works or achieves the goals an economy ought to strive for? Why should collective enrichment, technological progress, increased productivity, and globalism be measures of a successful economy, while social disruption, social stratification, wealth inequality, destruction of jobs, the loss of meaningful work, environmental degradation, etc. be considered necessary but ultimately irrelevant collateral damage? Especially when meaningful employment and a healthy environment are core elements of human thriving, should these not be seen as essential metrics of a successful economy, or at least metrics that successful economies should strive for to the best of their ability if their full realization is limited by factors outside of human control? Similarly, with education, how can we truly produce a values-neutral education that teaches necessary skills and nothing more? If the goal is to avoid lawmakers imposing their worldview on others, how can one formulate a productive education without first answering questions about what productivity means? Should education be generalized so that students can specialize in anything later down the line? Or should education be specialized from the beginning so that students can quickly transition into industries deemed most important to the economy? Should students be pushed towards the jobs they are most likely to secure, towards the jobs that are most likely to pay well, or towards the jobs that the economy is most likely to need? Should schools promote college for more students, or should schools promote trade schools or blue-collar work too? What skills are truly useful, and what knowledge is truly necessary? Is history necessary knowledge, or is it subjective and thus subject to becoming a vehicle for propaganda? Simply put, it is impossible to formulate an education that is not shaped by the assessments and biases of those designing the curriculum. And since, like with economics, the consequences that flow from curricula and the assumptions behind it are endless, both for the outcome of people's lives and the way they view the world, is it not crucial that we be deliberate about what principles inform the education we give our students? Here, I would again like to read an excerpt of E.F. Schumacher's book Small is Beautiful. Quote, "All history, as well as all current experience, point to the fact that it is man, not nature, who provides the primary resource. In a very real sense, therefore, we can say that education is the most vital of all resources. If Western civilization is in a state of permanent crisis, it is not far-fetched to suggest that there may be something wrong with its education. Lord Snow talked about the two cultures in the scientific revolution, and expressed his concern that the intellectual life of the whole of Western society is increasingly being split into two polar groups. At one pole we have the literary intellectuals, at the other the scientists. He deplores the gulf of mutual incomprehension between these two groups and wants it bridged. It is quite clear how he thinks this bridging operation is to be done. The aims of his educational policy would be, first, to get as many Alpha Plus scientists as the country can throw up. Second, to train a much larger stratum of alpha professionals to do the supporting research, high-class design, and development. Third, train thousands upon thousands of other scientists and engineers. And finally, to train politicians, administrators, an entire community who know enough science to have a sense of what scientists are talking about. If this fourth and last group can at least be educated to have a sense of what real people, i.e. the scientists and engineers, are talking about, so Lord Snow seems to suggest, the gulf of mutual incomprehension between the two cultures may be bridged. These ideas on education, which are by no means unrepresentative of our times, leave one with the uncomfortable feeling that ordinary people are really not much use. They have failed to make the grade. But, at least, they should be educated enough to have a sense of what is going on, and to know what the scientists mean when they talk. It's an uncomfortable feeling, because the scientists never tire of telling us that the fruits of their labor are neutral. Whether they enrich humanity or destroys it depends on how they are used. And who is to decide how they are used? There is nothing in the training of scientists or engineers to enable them to take such decisions, or else, what becomes of the neutrality of science? Science and engineering produce know-how, but know-how is nothing by itself. It is a means without an end, a mere potentiality, an unfinished sentence. Know-how is no more a culture than a piano is music. Can education help us finish the sentence, to turn the potentiality into a reality for the benefit of man? To do so, the task of education would be, first and foremost, the transmission of ideas of value, of what to do with our lives. There is no doubt about the need to transmit know-how, but this must take second place, for it is obviously somewhat foolhardy to put great powers into the hands of people without making sure they have a reasonable idea of what to do with them. At present, there can be little doubt that the whole of mankind is in mortal danger, not because we are short of scientific and technological know-how, but because we tend to use it destructively without wisdom. More education can help us only if it produces more wisdom. But values do not help us pick our way through life unless they have become our own, a part, so to say, of our mental makeup. This means that they are more than mere formulae or dogmatic assertions, that we think and feel with them, that they are the very instruments through which we look at, interpret, and experience the world. Our mind is not a blank, a tabula rasa. When we begin to think, we can do so only because our mind is already filled with all sorts of ideas with which to think." End quote. I suspect that you, the viewer, likely felt that Lord Snow's description of education was eerily familiar. Is that system much different than the so-called values-neutral education proposed by certain factions of the political right today? Such a system might be successful at producing large amounts of scientists and engineers, and it might help certain individuals find good-paying jobs. But what are we as a society to do with the expertise of the scientists and engineers we create? Can pure knowledge transmit wisdom? It's somewhat ironic that the same side of the political spectrum that criticizes academia, rails against the wealthy establishment elite, and bemoans a technocratic government run by scientific experts, pushes a system of education that, in practice, streamlines society's way towards that very outcome. If we hold up scientists and engineers as the example par excellence of what our children should aspire to become so as to be financially well-to-do, but we decry those who teach the humanities as indoctrinators who are ultimately useless to society and should be looked down upon because they make pennies, why are we surprised that we end up with a society where wealthy people and scientists make all the decisions and look with scorn upon those who challenge their supposedly value-neutral expertise with conversations about human dignity and moral values? Make no mistake, there's nothing wrong with being a scientist or an engineer. These individuals play an invaluable role in society and should be genuinely looked up to. But to look towards them exclusively is to fail to account for the whole picture of what makes for a successful civilization with a thriving culture. Science and technology are tools, and to be responsible, we must know how to wield those tools. So, if values-based education, if love of wisdom, incidentally the definition of philosophy, are necessary, what values ought we to transmit? Well, first and foremost, how can anyone expect a society to respect the dignity of all humans if those who comprise it don't first understand their own lives to be metaphysically significant? Here I will again return to Schumacher. Quote, "Estrangement breeds loneliness and despair. The encounter with nothingness, cynicism, empty gestures of defiance, as we can see in the greater part of existentialist philosophy and general literature today. Or, it suddenly turns into ardent adoption of fanatical teaching like fascism or communism, which, by a monstrous simplification of reality, pretends to answer all questions. So, what is the cause of estrangement? Never has science been more triumphant. Never has man's power over his environment been more complete, nor his progress faster. It cannot be a lack of know-how that causes the despair not only of religious thinkers like Kierkegaard, but also of leading mathematicians and scientists like Russell and Hoyle. We know how to do many things, but do we know what to do? What then is education? Is it the transmission of ideas which enable man to choose between one thing and another? Or, to quote Ortega y Gasset again, to live a life which is something above meaningless tragedy or inward disgrace? Where then shall we turn? Maybe, in spite of all he hears about the scientific revolution and ours being an age of science, he turns to the so-called humanities. Let us see what are the main ideas he is likely to find today." End quote. Here, I will not quote him in its entirety for brevity's sake, but I will summarize the ideas he identifies as dominant in modern humanitarian circles. Darwinian evolutionary principles, such as the notion of thriving by means of success in the face of competition, should be applied to society at large. Human history is ultimately the culmination of class warfare, and the artistic elements of culture are nothing more than what Marx calls the phantasmagorias in the brain of men, and the necessary supplements of the material life process that ultimately disguise economic interests. Human desires can be reduced to the stirrings of the subconscious mind that result from repressed and unfulfilled wishes, many of which are sexual in nature. There are no absolute truths, and morals are ultimately relative, and humans can only arrive at truths by means of the scientific method because material reality is ultimately all there is. To continue, quote, "These ideas are not the result of a narrow empiricism. No amount of factual enquiry could have verified any one of them. They represent tremendous leaps of the imagination into the unknown and unknowable. Of course, the leap is taken from a small platform of observed fact. These ideas could not have lodged themselves as firmly into men's minds as they have done if they did not contain important elements of truth. But their essential character is their claim of universality. What do these ideas have in common, besides their non-empirical metaphysical nature? They all assert that what had previously been taken to be something of a higher order is really nothing but a more subtle manifestation of the lower, unless, indeed, the very distinction between higher and lower is denied. Thus man, like the rest of the universe, is really nothing more than an accidental collocation of atoms. The difference between a man and a stone is little more than a deceptive appearance. Man's highest cultural achievements are nothing more than disguised economic greed or the outflow of sexual frustrations. In any case, it is meaningless to say that man should aim at the higher rather than the lower, because no intelligible meaning can be attached to purely subjective notions like higher or lower, while the word should is just a sign of authoritarian megalomania. To the originators, these ideas were simply the result of their intellectual processes. In the third and fourth generations, they've become the very tools and instruments through which the world is being experienced and interpreted." End quote. So now we see what the right is reacting to in its push for values-neutral education. One can point to any particular hot-button issue in the culture war, but in general, what most conservatives object to primarily is the installation of a positivist, materialist worldview in the minds of our nation's youth. As society becomes increasingly ideologically and religiously diverse, the left has taken on an increasingly secular political framework with the aim of promoting equality and avoiding undue favoritism towards people of a particular demographic. When faced with diverse metaphysical frameworks, one can either assert that lack of certainty means that institutions should remain agnostic to such questions and leave it up to individuals to determine for themselves what the truth is, or one could assert that a particular worldview is right and promote it above and in opposition to all others. Which does American liberal society do? Well, despite claiming to do the former, it more often does the latter, teaching a kind of atheistic materialism while presenting it as the supposedly undeniable logical consequence of the scientific expertise we value so greatly. Yet, as Schumacher points out, quote, "The leading ideas of the 19th century which claim to do away with metaphysics are themselves a bad, vicious, life-destroying type of metaphysics. We are suffering from them as from a fatal disease. It is not true that knowledge is sorrow, but poisonous errors bring unlimited sorrow. The errors are not in science, but in the philosophy put forward in the name of science. All we got was bad metaphysics and appalling ethics." End quote. What is the consequence of such ideas? Quote, "A view of the world as a wasteland in which there is no meaning or purpose, in which man's consciousness is an unfortunate cosmic accident, in which anguish and despair are the only final realities." End quote. In other words, quote, "We have become confused as to what our convictions really are. The great ideas of the 19th century may fill our minds in one way or another, but our hearts do not believe in them all the same. Mind and heart are at war with each other, not, as it is commonly asserted, reason and faith. Our reason has become beclouded by an extraordinary blind and unreasonable faith in a set of fantastic and life-destroying ideas inherited from the 19th century. It is the foremost task of our reason to recover a truer faith than that." End quote. What then is the solution? Where do we find an answer to the soul-destroying philosophy of the 19th century, which seems to cloud itself in an air of unquestionable certainty? Are we simply to live blindly off the fumes of the great ideas of times past, restoring traditions for their utility, while living with the cognitive dissonance that we don't believe the principles behind those traditions to be true? No. The answer to bad philosophy, simply put, is good philosophy. As Schumacher writes, quote, "Education cannot help us as long as it accords no place to metaphysics. Whether the subjects taught are subjects of science or of the humanities, if the teaching does not lead to a clarification of metaphysics, that is to say, of our fundamental convictions, it cannot educate a man." End quote. This does not mean a generic liberal arts education that teaches a wide variety of subjects merely for the sake of doing so, which many have criticized, not without reason, as being a waste of resources to train people in fields they have no interest in ever pursuing. Rather, it means that whatever subjects we do choose to study, we should study with greater depth and with an awareness of the limitations of the explanatory scope of that particular field. Schumacher continues, quote, "The sciences are being taught without any awareness of the presuppositions of science, of the meaning and significance of scientific laws, and of the place occupied by the natural sciences within the whole cosmos of human thought. The result is that the presuppositions of science are often mistaken for its findings. Economics is being taught without any awareness of the view of human nature that underlies present-day economic theory. In fact, many economists are themselves unaware of the fact that such a view is implicit in their teaching, and that nearly all their theories would have to be changed if that view changed. How could there be a rational teaching of politics without pressing all questions back to their metaphysical roots? Political thinking must necessarily become confused and end in double talk if there is a continued refusal to admit the serious study of metaphysical and ethical problems involved. All subjects, no matter how specialized, are connected with a center. They are like rays emanating from a sun. The center is constituted by our most basic convictions, by those ideas which really have the power to move us. In other words, the center consists of metaphysics and ethics, of ideas that, whether we like it or not, transcend the world of facts. Because they transcend the world of facts, they cannot be proved or disproved by ordinary scientific method. But that does not mean that they are purely subjective or relative or mere arbitrary conventions. They must be true to reality, although they transcend the world of facts. An apparent paradox to our positivistic thinkers." End quote. To put it another way, the issue with education as it currently exists is that the university, a place where the one truth is meant to be explored from interdisciplinary perspectives, is not so much a true unity, but rather a bunch of independent departments that have little or nothing to do with each other, and thus see little value in interdisciplinary dialogue. Specialized thinkers often fail to see the presuppositions behind their own fields, and further overextend their assumptions of their own field into others. It is not so much that people actively campaign against interdisciplinary dialogue, but rather that such dialogue fails to be fruitful when we don't recognize that higher fields, most especially that of metaphysics, order everything and form the connections between the lower fields. In short, there is a hierarchy of disciplines, and philosophy is indispensable to properly ordering this hierarchy. We often assume that we should begin with what appears to be the most certain, that which, according to certain theories of epistemology, form the foundation of all the rest that we know. In light of this assumption, moderns tend to hold that the natural sciences are the highest sciences, that shall order everything else because that which is derived from empirical observation is most certain. However, the methodology by which we discover truth does not determine whether something is first in the order of being. Such faulty assumptions are precisely what led to the formation of the soul-destroying ideas of the 19th century that Schumacher criticizes, including the undermining of ethics. To quote Schumacher one last time, quote, "The intellectuals, whose function it would be to get these things sorted out, spend their time proclaiming that everything is relative, or something to the same effect. Or they deal with ethical matters in terms of the most unabashed cynicism. The late Lord Keynes said, For at least another 100 years, we must pretend to ourselves and to everyone that fair is foul and foul is fair. For foul is useful and fair is not. Avarice and usury and precaution must be our gods for a little longer still. When great and brilliant men talk like this, we cannot be surprised if there arises a certain confusion between fair and foul, which leads to double talk as long as things are quiet, and to crime when things get a bit more heated. In ethics, we have recklessly and willfully abandoned our great classical Christian heritage. We have even degraded the very words without which ethical discourse cannot carry on. Words like virtue, love, temperance. As a result, we are totally ignorant, totally uneducated in the subject that, of all the conceivable subjects, is the most important. We have no ideas to think with, and therefore are only too ready to believe that ethics is a field where thinking does no good. Who knows today of the 7 deadly sins or of the 4 cardinal virtues? Who could even name them? And if these venerable old ideas are thought not to be worth bothering about, what new ideas have taken their place? What is to take the place of the soul and life-destroying metaphysics inherited from the 19th century? The task of our generation, I have no doubt, is one of metaphysical reconstruction. It is not as if we had to invent anything new. At the same time, it is not enough merely to revert to old formulations. Our task, and the task of all education, is to understand the present world, the world in which we live, and make our choices. We are suffering from a metaphysical disease, and the cure must therefore be metaphysical. Education which fails to clarify our central convictions is mere training or indulgence. For it is our central convictions that are in disorder, and, as long as the present anti-metaphysical temper persists, the disorder will grow worse. Education, far from ranking as man's greatest resource, will then be an agent of destruction, in accord with the principle corruptio optimi pessima. End quote. So finally, we see what the task of education must be. Reconstructing our worldview to replace the soul-destroying philosophy we have inherited with something that is metaphysically and ethically sound, while acknowledging the significance of human life and the dignity of every human person. There are many proposed solutions to do that, and to provide a definitive solution here would transcend the scope of this video, although I certainly have my own ideas. But we can see at least that education, more than simply being a training program for future jobs, must also instill the ideas by which we interact with the world and make our choices. While academics and universities should go about the difficult work of reformulating good philosophy, at lower levels, we should at the very least strive to teach people the good ideas that teach them to value themselves, respect that which is around them, and live good, virtuous lives. Rather than look with disdain on the positive things we have inherited, we should teach our children the positive values that we can take from our ancestors, even if there are things that can be rightfully criticized. And so, is it possible or desirable to have a values-neutral education? I don't believe so. Education, first and foremost, must be the means by which we understand ourselves, our place in the cosmos, and how we choose between one thing and another. After that, once we have a solid sense of core convictions, everything else can flow more naturally. So, what do you think? Is values-neutral education possible? Should we strive for a purely productive education from an economic standpoint? Or does education serve a deeper purpose that instills a sense of identity and core conviction in those who benefit from it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when new videos are released. Also be sure to like this video so that YouTube recommends it to others. If you'd like to support this channel for as little as $1 a month, you can also become a supporter on Patreon. Links in the description of this video. I look forward to the philosophical journey ahead with you. Peace be with you. This has been The Philosopher.